It is a pleasure to finally meet you, sir. I have heard so much about your endeavors.
Your Majesty, a voice said, low and melodic, cutting through the din of the great hall. I am Anastasia Vorin. King Nikolai Drayan, the feared Alpha of the North, looked up. The woman standing before his dais was the source of the sudden, shocking silence that had just fallen over the room. A silence more valuable than gold in a hall thick with the scent of roasted boar, pine, and the damp chill of stone. The moment she spoke, every other conversation had not just faltered. It had ceased, cut clean as if by a blade. He, a king accustomed to taking what he wanted, found himself watching as she offered a curtsy that was both respectful and utterly devoid of submission. It was a gesture of protocol, nothing more. Her eyes met his for the first time, and Nikolai felt an unexpected jolt, a low growl of something primal and possessive stirring in his chest. It was the wolf in him, the part that recognized power, that acknowledged a challenge. He had agreed to this political marriage, this union decreed by the Wolf Council, as a mere formality. He had expected a timid girl, the daughter of a bankrupt duke, easily managed and quickly forgotten. He had not expected this woman who moved as if the very air parted for her, whose silence was louder than the drunken laughter that had filled the hall only moments before. She wore a gown of emerald velvet, the color of a deep forest after a storm. It was a defiant splash of life against the hall's muted tapestries of gray and brown, which depicted ancient hunts and forgotten wars. The lace, dark as shadow, clung to her form, a whisper of elegance in a room built for brutes. Her copper hair was a cascade of controlled waves, catching the candlelight and framing a face that was unnervingly calm. It was this calm, more than her beauty, that held the room captive. In a den of wolves, a lamb that does not tremble is a creature to be watched. Nikolai rose from his throne, a predator unfolding. He was taller than she had imagined, broader. The stories had not exaggerated his dangerous beauty. The smile he gave her was legendary, a flash of white teeth that was more threat than welcome. Lady Anastasia, welcome to the North. I trust your journey was tolerable. He took her hand, his touch firm and cold, and led her to the seat beside his throne. It was a place of honor, a place that declared her his. As they sat, a low murmur rippled through the hall, the wolves of his court resuming their conversations. But their eyes kept straying back to the woman in green. The game had begun, and its most important piece had just been placed. The feast resumed, a cacophony of clattering silver and boisterous talk. The lords of the council, seated near the king, turned their discussion from the bride to more pressing matters. Trade routes, border skirmishes, and the ever-present threat of the rebel clans in the southern mountains. They spoke with the blunt confidence of men accustomed to power, their voices thick with wine and certainty. Anastasia ate sparingly, a silent observer at the heart of the storm. She listened, her gaze moving from one speaker to the next, her expression unreadable. She tracked the flow of the conversation like a hunter tracking prey, noting the subtle shifts in alliances, the flicker of greed in one lord's eyes, the weary resignation in another's. They spoke of a new trade route, a bold plan to cut through the foothills of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, bypassing the territory of a rival pack and saving weeks of travel. It's a masterstroke, declared Lord Valerius, a burly man with a thick gray beard, slamming his fist on the table for emphasis. The rebels in that region are scattered, a few well-placed patrols, and the route is ours. The others nodded in agreement, their minds already counting the profits. Nikolai listened, his chin resting on his hand, a flicker of boredom in his icy eyes. The plan was sound, vetted by his best generals. It was a formality, a final confirmation before the orders were given. Then a quiet voice cut through the masculine din. It will fail. It was Anastasia. She hadn't raised her voice, yet the words landed with the force of a thrown dagger. Small talk died in their throats. Lord Valerius turned to her, his face flushing with indignation. My lady, these are matters of state. Perhaps you are not familiar with... I am familiar with maps, she interrupted, her tone still soft, yet edged with steel. She looked not at Valerius, but directly at the king. The route you propose cuts through the Whispering Valley. You call the rebels there scattered. I call them patient. They don't need to face your patrols head-on. They will wait for your first caravans, heavy with goods, and then trigger a single rock slide. The valley has one entrance and one exit. Your caravans will be trapped, your guards picked off one by one, and the rebels will be supplied for the entire winter with northern goods. The silence that followed was profound. The counselors stared at her, their mouths agape. In the space of a few sentences, she had dismantled a strategy that had taken them months to devise. She had seen the flaw none of them had, the simple, deadly logic of the terrain. Nikolai slowly straightened in his throne. The boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp, dangerous focus. He stared at the woman beside him, this supposed pawn in a political game, and saw a mind that moved with the lethal precision of an assassin. She hadn't just offered an opinion, she had exposed the arrogance of his entire council. He leaned toward her, his voice a low, dangerous purr that was meant for her alone. And how, my lady, would you have done it? Anastasia met his gaze without flinching. I wouldn't have. I would have sent empty wagons first, with a small elite force hidden inside. Let the rebels spring their trap. And when they come down to claim their prize, they will find not merchants, but the teeth of the northern wolves waiting for them. A slow, predatory smile spread across Nikolai's face. It was a genuine smile this time, and it was terrifying. He looked at his stunned counselors, then back at his bride-to-be. The wolf inside him, the part that had been restless and bored, was now wide awake. This was no lamb. This was steel wrapped in emerald velvet. Well, my lords, Nikolai said, his voice booming through the hall. It seems we have a new strategist at the table. Later that night, long after the feast had ended and the lords had stumbled off to their chambers, Nikolai found her on a balcony overlooking the snow-dusted courtyard. The moon was a sharp sliver in the black sky, and the air was cold enough to steal one's breath. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, the emerald velvet of her dress a dark jewel against the pale stone. He approached without a sound, his steps absorbed by the shadows. He had dismissed his guards, wanting this confrontation to be his alone. He stopped a few feet behind her, watching the way the cold air turned her breath into a fleeting mist. You embarrassed my council, he said, his voice a low rumble. Anastasia didn't turn. Your council embarrassed themselves. I merely pointed it out. He moved to stand beside her, leaning against the balustrade. He was close enough now to feel the subtle warmth radiating from her, to smell the faint scent of pine, and something uniquely her own. You have a sharp tongue, my lady. In the north, such things can get you into trouble. Is that a threat, your majesty? She finally turned her head, her eyes catching the faint moonlight. They were not green, as he had first thought, but a complex hazel that shifted with the light. It's an observation, he countered, letting his gaze drift over her, deliberately provocative. He was used to women blushing or looking away under his scrutiny. Anastasia did neither. She simply watched him, her expression a mask of cool indifference. Then allow me to make an observation of my own, she said. You surround yourself with men who tell you what you want to hear. It makes you predictable. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. It was a direct strike at his authority, at his very identity as an alpha. A lesser man would have raged. Nikolai felt a thrill. He pushed off the balustrade, closing the small space between them. He was a wall of muscle and power, looming over her. And you think you can predict me? He murmured, his voice dropping to the husky tone that had undone countless women. I think you are a man who has never been denied anything, she replied, her voice unwavering, though he could see the pulse beating a little faster at the base of her throat. You take what you want, and you discard it when you are bored. You believe this marriage is just another acquisition? And is it not? He whispered, his face now inches from hers. He could see the fine details of her skin, the slight parting of her lips. The urge to close that final distance, to crush her mouth under his and prove that she was, in fact, just like all the others, was a physical ache. But her next words stopped him cold. "I am not one of your conquests, Your Majesty." Her gaze was as sharp and unyielding as a shard of ice. "I am the daughter of a duke, the price of peace for your kingdom, and I will be your queen. You will treat me with the respect that title demands, or this alliance will be built on a foundation of ash." He stared at her, momentarily speechless. No one had ever spoken to him this way. No one had ever dared. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. He had come out here to put her in her place, to assert his dominance. Instead, he found himself on the defensive, disarmed by her quiet strength. He took a step back, a slow, deliberate retreat. A genuine laugh, low and rough, escaped him. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met, or the most foolish." "The line between the two is often thin," Anastasia said, turning her gaze back to the courtyard. "You would do well to remember that." Nikolai watched her for a long moment, the predator in him assessing, re-evaluating. The game had changed. This was not about a simple political union anymore. It was about her. About the fire he saw banked behind her calm eyes. About the irresistible urge to see if he could be the one to finally make it burn. He turned and walked away without another word, the sound of his boots echoing in the silent night. The first strike had been made, but for the first time in his life, Nikolai Drayan was not entirely sure who had landed it. In the days that followed the banquet, Anastasia became a fixture in the council chamber. It was an unprecedented move. The wives of northern lords were expected to manage households, not debate policy. But after her public dismantling of their strategy, no one dared to openly object when the king himself invited her to attend. He had framed it as a courtesy to his future queen, a way for her to understand the workings of her new kingdom. But everyone in the room knew it was a test. She sat not at the main table, but slightly behind the king, a silent observer. Yet, her presence shifted the room's entire dynamic. The lords, usually so bombastic and sure of themselves, chose their words more carefully. They found themselves glancing in her direction, as if seeking an approval they hadn't realized they needed. Her silence was more intimidating than any argument. Nikolai watched it all with a grim satisfaction. He saw the way Lord Valerius now presented his reports with a new, uncharacteristic humility. He saw how the younger lords, once eager to impress with reckless bravado, now spoke of caution and logistics. She was a whetstone, sharpening their minds through sheer intimidation. During a heated debate over a border dispute with a neighboring clan, the discussion stalled. One faction argued for an immediate, aggressive response, while the other urged diplomacy. Nikolai, growing impatient, was about to impose his own will when he felt a light touch on his arm. It was Anastasia. She leaned forward, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "They are both wrong. The clan is not the threat. It's the land. The river is running low this season. They are desperate for new grazing territory. Offer them access to the northern pastures for a tithe. It is a temporary problem that requires a temporary solution, not a war." Nikolai looked at her, then back at his counsel. He stood, his voice cutting through the arguments. "Lord Valerius, you will ride out tomorrow. You will not carry swords. You will carry an offer. Access to the northern pastures until the spring rains, in exchange for a 10% tithe on their herds." The council was stunned into silence, not by the order, but by its simple, elegant logic. It was a solution that avoided bloodshed, and turned a potential enemy into a temporary vassal. Only one man in the room seemed unimpressed. Viktor Dragunov, the king's chief counselor, a man with a face like a clenched fist, watched Anastasia with narrowed, calculating eyes. He had been the loudest voice for aggression, and she had just neutered his position without saying a word to the council. "A bold move, Your Majesty," Viktor said, his voice smooth as oil, yet with a venomous undertone. "Let us hope the lady's intuition does not lead our kingdom to ruin." Nikolai's gaze turned to ice. Her intuition has more strategic value than your entire war council, Victor. Remember your place. The threat was clear. But as Nikolai turned his attention back to the proceedings, he caught Anastasia's eye. She was watching him, and for the first time, he saw something other than cool assessment in her gaze. It was a flicker of something. Respect? Gratitude? He couldn't be sure. But the feeling it ignited in his chest was a dangerous, unfamiliar warmth. He was defending her, and the realization was as unsettling as it was satisfying. The tension that had been simmering between them for days finally came to a boil during a formal gathering a week after her arrival. The great hall was filled with music, the lilting melody of a string quartet, a stark contrast to the undercurrent of political maneuvering that defined the northern court. Nikolai had been holding court, a flagon of wine in his hand, a different beautiful woman laughing at his jokes every few minutes. It was a performance he had perfected, the role of the charming, roguish king. But his eyes kept finding Anastasia. She stood near the hearth, speaking with a young, handsome general who was clearly captivated by her. She was smiling, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and the sight of it sent a hot spike of jealousy through Nikolai's gut. It was an emotion so foreign, so unwelcome, that it took him a moment to even identify it. He, who had his choice of any woman in the kingdom, was jealous of a provincial general making his future queen smile. He set his flagon down with a thud. Excusing himself from his fawning admirers, he crossed the hall with unhurried command that made people instinctively step out of his path. He reached Anastasia just as the general was bowing over her hand. "General," Nikolai said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "I require a word with my betrothed." The general paled and practically fled. Anastasia turned to Nikolai, her smile gone, replaced by a coolly arched eyebrow. "Is there something you need, Your Majesty?" "I need a dance," he said, and before she could protest, he took her hand and pulled her onto the dance floor. The other couples immediately parted, clearing a space for their king. He pulled her close, one hand firmly on the small of her back, the other holding her hand in a grip that was just short of painful. The music was a slow, elegant waltz, but there was nothing elegant about the way he held her. It was an act of possession, a public declaration. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her body rigid in his arms. "I am dancing with my future wife," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Is that not allowed? You are making a scene. I am the king. The scene is wherever I am." He spun her, his movements precise and dominant. He could feel the tension in her, the coiled strength. She was not afraid of him, and that infuriated and fascinated him in equal measure. "You think you can play with me like you play with the others?" she said, her voice low and fierce. "Parade me around to soothe your bruised ego?" He stopped dancing, holding her still in the center of the floor. The other dancers gave them a wide berth, their whispers a low buzz. His ice-blue eyes bored into hers. "I thought you were a woman like all the others," he admitted, his voice a rough, husky whisper. "I thought you could be bought, managed, and set aside." "You thought wrong," she shot back, not retreating an inch. Her hazel eyes flashed with fire. "I am not a game to be won, Nikolai." It was the first time she had used his name, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, she was not Lady Anastasia, his arranged bride. She was a woman, his equal, and she was challenging him on a level no one ever had. "If you want me," she said, her voice dropping, each word a carefully placed stone, "you will have to earn me." He stared at her, the sounds of the hall fading away. The music, the whispers, the watching eyes. It all disappeared. There was only her, this impossible, infuriating, magnificent woman who refused to bend, who demanded not just his respect, but his effort. For the first time in his life, Nikolai Drayan, the Alpha of the North, was faced with something he couldn't conquer. He had to deserve it. A slow smile touched his lips, but this time it held no arrogance, only a dawning, dangerous realization. The hunt had just become infinitely more interesting. The dance was a turning point. The entire court saw it. The king, who had always treated women as disposable pleasures, had been publicly challenged by his betrothed. They expected fireworks, a royal tantrum, perhaps even the quiet dismissal of the impertinent Lady Voren. What they got was something far more shocking, a change in the king himself. Nikolai stopped his public flirtations. The gaggle of beautiful, empty-headed ladies who had always surrounded him found themselves suddenly ignored. When one of them, a bold baroness, tried to sit on the arm of his throne during a council meeting, he fixed her with a look so cold it sent her scurrying from the room in tears. His attention, once a scattered and careless thing, was now a laser focused on one person. He began to seek out Anastasia's company, not for public displays, but for private conversations. He would find her in the library, where she spent hours poring over maps and histories, and simply sit with her in silence, reading his own scrolls. He would ask her opinion on matters of trade, of law, of strategy, and he would actually listen to her answers. He started sending her small, thoughtful gifts. Not jewels or gowns, but a rare book on military theory, a finely crafted writing set, a map of the southern territories annotated in his own hand. Anastasia watched this transformation with a cautious, guarded curiosity. She had thrown down the gauntlet, expecting a battle of wills. She had not expected a surrender. Or, if not a surrender, then a change in tactics so profound it left her off balance. This new Nikolai was more dangerous than the arrogant womanizer. This quiet, attentive man was a threat not to her pride, but to her heart. One afternoon, as they walked along the castle ramparts, a cold wind whipping their cloaks around them, he spoke of his childhood. He told her of his father, a hard, unforgiving man who had ruled the north with an iron fist. He spoke of the pressure to be strong, to be ruthless, to be the perfect alpha. "My father taught me that sentiment was a weakness," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant snow-capped mountains. "He said a king's heart must be as hard as the winter ground." "And do you believe that?" Anastasia asked softly. Nikolai turned to her, his expression raw and vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "I did. Until you." The words hung in the air between them, a confession that was more intimate than any kiss. Anastasia's carefully constructed walls trembled. She had prepared for a battle of wits, for a political chess match. She had not prepared for this, for a man, a king, laying his soul bare before her. "You are not what I expected," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Neither are you," he said, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "I thought I was getting a queen. I did not realize I was getting a reckoning." He reached out, his gloved fingers gently brushing a strand of copper hair from her face. It was a simple gesture, yet it was filled with a tenderness that made her breath catch. The court had noticed the change in him. But here, on the cold ramparts, with the wind howling around them, Anastasia realized the change was deeper than anyone knew. The king was not just courting her. He was letting her see the man behind the crown. And that man was someone she was beginning to realize she could not only respect, but perhaps even love. Just as a fragile warmth began to grow between Nikolai and Anastasia, the shadows in the court started to lengthen. Viktor Dragunov, his pride wounded and his influence threatened, was not a man to accept defeat. He saw Anastasia not as a strategic asset, but as a foreign poison seeping into the heart of his king, weakening him, changing him. And he decided to cut her out. He began his work in the shadows, in hushed conversations in dark corridors and over late-night cups of ale in the barracks. He didn't need to create lies, merely to twist the truth. Anastasia's intelligence became cunning manipulation. Her quiet confidence became arrogance. Her presence in the council was painted as an act of usurpation. "Have you seen how he looks at her?" Victor would murmur to a disgruntled lord. "He hangs on her every word. A woman is leading the North, and we are letting it happen." To the soldiers, his words were different, more direct. She is from the south. Her loyalties are not ours. She advises the king to make peace with our enemies. How long before her advice leaves our borders undefended? Whispers grew into rumors. Rumors hardened into suspicion. The court, once merely curious about Anastasia, began to divide. Some, who had witnessed her intelligence firsthand, defended her. But many, steeped in the North's patriarchal traditions and suspicious of outsiders, were easily swayed. They saw a king who had abandoned his boisterous ways, who now spent his time with a quiet, calculating woman. They saw weakness. Anastasia was not deaf to the whispers. She felt the change in the atmosphere, the way some courtiers would fall silent when she entered a room, the suspicious glances from the castle guards. She remained outwardly composed, her serene mask firmly in place. But inside, a cold anger began to build. These were Nikolai's people, his pack, and they were turning on her. One evening, Nikolai found her staring into the fire in her chambers, her book forgotten in her lap. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle. "They are calling me a witch," she said, without looking at him. "A sorceress who has enchanted their king." Nikolai's face hardened. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were cold as ice. "Let them talk. They are fools. Their words are meaningless." "Words have power, Nikolai," she countered, her gaze finally meeting his. "They are seeds, and Victor is planting them in fertile ground. He is turning your own people against me, against us." He saw the hurt in her eyes, a crack in the armor she wore so well, and it enraged him. The next day, he made a public show of his support. During the midday meal in the Great Hall, he walked to where Anastasia sat, and in front of the entire court, he took her hand and kissed it. Then he looked out at the assembled lords and ladies, his eyes blazing with cold fire. "Let it be known," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Lady Anastasia is my chosen queen. An insult to her is an insult to me. The next person I hear spreading malicious gossip will answer to me directly, and I assure you, you will not enjoy the conversation." The hall was utterly silent. It was a direct challenge, a line drawn in the snow. But as Nikolai stood there, defiant, with Anastasia's hand in his, he knew it was not enough. A king's decree could silence whispers, but it could not kill the roots of a conspiracy. Victor's game was more dangerous than he had imagined, and the seeds of doubt had already been sown. Anastasia knew that Nikolai's public defense, while welcome, was a temporary shield. A conspiracy could not be defeated with royal decrees. It had to be exposed, its roots torn out, and left to wither in the light. She could not sleep, her mind racing, replaying Victor's words, his smug expressions, the subtle ways he had tried to undermine her from the beginning. His opposition was not just political, it was personal, and that made him dangerous. Driven by a cold certainty that Victor's treachery went deeper than mere rumors, she began her own investigation. She started in the one place she felt truly at home, the castle archives. It was a vast, dusty library, filled with centuries of northern history, trade ledgers, and military records. The old wolf who served as the castle loremaster was only too happy to grant the king's betrothed access, assuming she was merely interested in the history of her new home. For 3 nights, while the castle slept, Anastasia worked by candlelight. She did not know what she was looking for, but she trusted her instincts. She started with the supply records for the border garrisons, the very ones Victor had been so eager to send into a foolish war. She cross-referenced the shipments of grain, weapons, and furs with the trade ledgers from the past 5 years. On the 3rd night, she found it, a pattern, subtle but undeniable. For years, there had been small but consistent discrepancies in the records. Shipments of high-quality northern furs, recorded as being sent to the western garrisons, never seemed to arrive. Instead, similar quantities of furs would appear in the trade ledgers of a merchant guild in a neutral territory, a guild known for its willingness to trade with anyone, including the rebel clans. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was more than just skimming profits. Furs were a currency in the north. High-quality pelts could buy weapons, mercenaries, and loyalty. Someone was systematically bleeding the kingdom's resources, and, very likely, funding its enemies. Her hands shaking slightly, she pulled the royal ledgers, the ones signed and sealed by the king's chief counselor. She traced the shipments back, her finger following the elegant, precise script. Every single falsified shipment, every missing cargo of furs, had been authorized and signed off by one man, Viktor Dragunov. Anastasia leaned back in her chair, the enormity of her discovery washing over her. Viktor wasn't just a political rival, he was a traitor. He was actively weakening the North from within, likely in preparation for a larger move. The border skirmishes, his push for war, it was all a distraction, a way to stretch the kingdom's resources thin while he armed its enemies. Her arrival had been an unforeseen complication, her influence over Nikolai a direct threat to his long-laid plans. She knew she had to tell Nikolai, but she also knew she needed more than just old ledgers. Viktor was a master of deceit. He would deny everything, paint her as a paranoid, power-hungry foreigner. She needed irrefutable proof. She needed to know where the next shipment was going, and she needed to catch him in the act. She carefully returned the ledgers to their shelves, leaving no trace of her search. As she walked back to her chambers through the silent, sleeping castle, the weight of her knowledge was a heavy cloak. The game was no longer about winning a king's heart or a place at the council table. It was about saving a kingdom. Anastasia found Nikolai in the armory, the air thick with the smell of steel and oil. He was practicing with a great sword, his movements a blur of deadly grace. He was shirtless, his torso gleaming with a light sheen of sweat, the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders coiling and uncoiling with each swing. He moved with a focus so intense that he did not notice her until he finally stopped, plunging the sword into a barrel of sand. He turned, breathing heavily, and his eyes widened slightly when he saw her. He was not accustomed to being seen in this state, not the king, not the alpha, but the warrior. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she began. "You are never a disturbance," he said, his voice rough. He grabbed a cloth and wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes never leaving hers. "What is it?" "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Something worse," she said, her voice low. She held out the small, rolled-up parchment she had been clutching. It was a summary of her findings, the dates, the quantities, the names. He took it from her, his brow furrowed in confusion. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, and then to a cold, terrifying fury. The muscles in his jaw clenched, and the parchment crumpled in his tightening fist. When he looked up at her, his winter-pale gaze was burning. "Viktor," he growled, the name a curse. "He's been doing it for years," Anastasia said, her voice steady despite the storm she saw in his eyes. "He's been funding the rebels. The attack he was pushing for, it was a trap. He wanted to send our best men into an ambush." Nikolai slammed his fist against a wooden weapons rack, the sound cracking through the armory like a thunderclap. "I trusted him. He was my father's right hand. He taught me how to fight, how to rule." The sense of betrayal was a raw, open wound on his face. He began to pace, a caged wolf, his rage a palpable force in the room. "I will kill him. I will tear him apart with my bare hands." "No," Anastasia said, stepping into his path. "A quick death is too easy. He has betrayed your kingdom, your father's memory, and you. He must be exposed. He must be judged by the very laws he sought to undermine." He stopped, staring down at her. Her calmness in the face of his rage was a balm, an anchor. He saw not fear in her eyes, but a shared strength, a partnership. In that moment, he realized how utterly he had come to rely on her mind, on her courage. "You have unmade me, Anastasia," he whispered, the words torn from him. "Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought I was, it's all turned to dust." He reached out, his hands framing her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. This woman who had walked into his life and set it on fire. "Then let me remake you," she whispered back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the frantic, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. The space between them vanished. His mouth came down on hers, not with the arrogant force she might have once expected, but with a desperate, searching hunger. It was a kiss of rage and relief, of betrayal, and a dawning, terrifying hope. She responded with equal fire, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. It was not a gentle first kiss. It was a storm, a collision of two powerful forces that had been circling each other for weeks. It was the breaking of walls, the baring of souls. When they finally broke apart, gasping for breath, they simply held each other, the silence of the armory a sacred space around them. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "He will not get away with this," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "We will not let him." She felt the shift in that single word. It was a promise. It was an alliance. It was the beginning of everything. They did not have to wait long. 2 nights later, the castle's great alarm bell began to toll, its frantic, clanging peal shattering the midnight peace. Howls answered across the courtyards as warriors half-shifted, eyes gone feral, nails turning to claws beneath leather gloves. It was a sound that had not been heard in a generation, a sound that meant only one thing. The North was under attack. Nikolai was already dressed and armed by the time Anastasia reached his chambers. He was pulling on his leather armor over a chainmail shirt, his face a mask of cold fury. His generals were shouting orders in the courtyard below, the sounds of men arming and horses being saddled rising into the night. "It's the northern border," he said without preamble, his voice tight. "A coordinated assault, just as you predicted. Victor's rebels." "How bad is it?" Anastasia asked, her own mind already racing, calculating. "They've broken through the outer defenses at the Redwater Pass. They're pouring into the valley. I'm leading the main force to cut them off." He strapped his greatsword to his back, his movements economical and deadly. He was no longer the king. He was the alpha, the warlord. "I'm coming with you," she said. It was not a request. He stopped and turned to her, his eyes blazing. "No, absolutely not. You will remain here in the keep, where it is safe." "The keep is the last place I should be," she countered, her voice ringing with an authority that matched his own. "Nikolai, listen to me. This isn't just a raid. It's a planned invasion. They will have a secondary force. While you engage their main army at the pass, they will send a smaller, faster pack to circle around and attack the villages in the Western Valley. They will slaughter the civilians and burn our winter stores." He stared at her, his mind processing her words. She was right. It was a classic pincer movement, a strategy designed to cause chaos and cripple the kingdom's resources. The auxiliary forces stationed at the western garrison. "They can handle it." "The auxiliary force is led by Lord Boren," she shot back. "He's a good man, but he's old and cautious. He will hold his position, but he will not anticipate their speed. They need a leader who can think like a hunter. They need me." He was shaking his head before she even finished. "I will not send you into battle. I will not risk you." She stepped closer, her hands coming up to grip the front of his armor. She forced him to look at her, to see the fire in her eyes. "You risk more by leaving me here. I am not a decoration to be protected, Nikolai. I am not some fragile flower. I am a wolf. I have studied the terrain. I know their tactics. I can save those people." He looked down at her, torn between his duty as a king and the primal, overwhelming need to protect the woman he loved. The thought of her in battle, of her facing the savagery of the rebels, was a physical pain. "I cannot lose you," he whispered, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer hide. "You won't," she promised, her gaze unwavering. "Trust me. Trust us. An alpha does not lead alone. We do this together, or we fail separately. He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He saw not a bride, not a queen, but a warrior, his equal in every way. He had told her she was his reckoning, and now he understood. She was not there to break him, but to make him whole, to make him a better leader. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. "Take my personal guard," he commanded, "and take a signal horn. If you are in trouble, you sound it, and I will come. I swear it, Anastasia, I will tear down the mountains themselves to get to you." "You won't have to," she said, a fierce smile touching her lips. She rose on her toes and gave him a hard, quick kiss. "Now go. Your army is waiting." He hesitated for a second more, then turned and strode from the room without looking back. Anastasia watched him go, then turned to the captain of his guard, who was staring at her with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. "Saddle my horse," she commanded. "We ride for the Western Valley." Anastasia rode under the full moon, a silver ghost at the head of 100 wolves. Nikolai's personal guard, the most elite warriors in the north, followed her without question. They had heard her exchange with the king, had seen the fire in her eyes. This was not a lady playing at war. This was a commander. The air was bitingly cold, and the snow-covered ground muffled the sound of their horses' hooves. Anastasia's mind was a whirlwind of maps and calculations. She knew the terrain of the Western Valley intimately from her studies. She knew the winding paths, the hidden ravines, the places where an ambush could be laid. As they neared the valley, she held up a hand, bringing the column to a halt. She dismounted, pressing her ear to the frozen ground. The others watched, confused. After a long moment, she stood, a grim look on her face. "They're close," she said, "and they're moving faster than I thought. They're not heading for the main village. They're making for the river, to cut off the escape route." "My lady," the captain of the guard said, "Lord Boren's forces are at the village. Our orders are to reinforce him." "Lord Boren is in the wrong place," Anastasia said, her voice sharp with certainty. "If we go to the village, the rebels will trap us there with the civilians. We intercept them at the river bend. Now." She swung back onto her horse, her decision absolute. The captain hesitated for only a second before shouting the order to follow. They galloped through the dark woods, their path guided by Anastasia's unerring sense of direction. They reached the river bend just as the rebel pack, a force of nearly 200 snarling, battle-hardened wolves, emerged from the trees on the opposite bank. They were a terrifying sight, their eyes glowing in the dark, their weapons stained with old blood. They paused, surprised to find their path blocked. Anastasia did not give them time to think. "Archers!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the night. "First rank! Fire!" A volley of arrows hissed across the river, felling the front line of the rebel force. Before they could recover, Anastasia drew her own sword, its polished steel gleaming in the moonlight. "For the north!" she cried, and spurred her horse forward, plunging into the shallow, icy river. The rest of her guard followed, their battle cry a thunderous roar that echoed through the valley. The two forces met in the middle of the river, with a brutal clash of steel and savagery. Anastasia was a whirlwind of motion, her blade a silver arc of death. She fought with a cold, precise fury, her movements economical and deadly. She was not just a strategist, she was a warrior, trained by her father since she was a child. She saw the rebel leader, a huge, scarred brute with a massive axe, cutting down one of her men. Without hesitation, she wheeled her horse and charged him. He turned, a look of contempt on his face as he saw it was a woman challenging him. It was the last mistake he ever made. She ducked under his wild swing, her own blade darting out like a serpent's tongue, finding the gap in his armor under his arm. He roared, a sound of shock and pain, and stumbled back, the axe falling from his numb fingers. Anastasia did not relent. She pressed her attack, her second strike swift and final. The rebel leader fell, his body swept away by the current. A moment of stunned silence fell over the battlefield. Seeing their leader fall, the rebels faltered. Their attack, once so ferocious, became a desperate scramble for survival. Anastasia's forces, sensing victory, pressed their advantage. The battle turned into a rout. The rebels broke and fled, hunted down in the dark woods by the vengeful northern wolves. As the dawn broke, casting a pale gray light over the blood-stained snow and water, Anastasia stood on the riverbank, breathing heavily. She was covered in mud and blood, some of it her own. A deep gash on her arm throbbed painfully, but she was alive, and the people of the valley were safe. She spoke their names to the river and promised their families the North would remember. Anastasia returned to the castle as the sun was climbing high into the morning sky. She was exhausted, her body ached, and the gash on her arm was a fiery line of pain. But as she rode through the main gates at the head of her victorious guard, she held her head high. He was waiting for her. Nikolai stood in the center of the courtyard, his armor splattered with the dirt and blood of his own battle. He had returned an hour before, his own forces having crushed the main rebel army at the pass. But there was no look of triumph on his face, only a raw, desperate anxiety. When he saw her, he froze. He took in her appearance, the blood, the exhaustion, the makeshift bandage on her arm, and then he ran to her. He didn't walk. He ran, closing the distance between them in a few long strides. He reached her just as she slid from her horse, her legs threatening to buckle. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling with a relief so profound it was almost violent. "You're alive," he murmured, the words a prayer against her skin. "You're alive." She leaned against him, her strength finally failing her, letting his solid presence hold her up. "I told you I would be." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his eyes scanning her for injuries. His gaze fell on her wounded arm, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she said, but her voice was thin. Without another word, he swept her up into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He turned and carried her into the keep, past the stunned guards and servants who had gathered to welcome their victorious king and his warrior queen. He didn't stop until he reached his own chambers. He laid her gently on the massive bed, his movements full of a tenderness that belied his great strength. He personally fetched a basin of warm water and clean linens, dismissing the servants who rushed to help. He knelt by the bed and carefully unwrapped the crude bandage on her arm. The gash was deep, angry, and red. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound, his brow furrowed in concentration. He worked in silence, his jaw tight with a mixture of anger and fear. When he was finished, he looked up at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite read. "You are my strength," he said, his voice thick and low. "And you are my ruin. Do you know what it did to me, sending you into that fight? It was like tearing out my own heart." Anastasia reached up, her hand gently touching his cheek. "And you will only be worthy of me," she whispered, her voice tired but firm, echoing the words she had spoken to him once before. "When you learn that an alpha doesn't lead alone, I am not your weakness, Nikolai. I am your partner." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. He knew she was right. Her courage had not been a liability. It had been the kingdom's salvation. He had been afraid of losing her, but he had been more afraid of the man he would be without her. He opened his eyes, and the last of his defenses crumbled. The king, the alpha, the warrior, they all fell away, leaving only the man, vulnerable and utterly in love. He leaned down and kissed her. A kiss of profound gratitude, of boundless respect, and of a love that had been forged in fire and blood. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a silent vow that they would face whatever came next, together. The next day, the Great Hall was convened for an emergency session of the council. But this was no ordinary meeting. The lords were assembled not at the long table, but as an audience. At the front of the hall, on the dais, sat King Nikolai on his throne. Beside him, in a seat of equal honor, was Anastasia. And standing before them, flanked by 4 of the king's personal guard, was Viktor Dragunov. Viktor stood with his head held high, a look of defiant arrogance on his face. He believed this was a political spectacle, a failed attempt by the foreign woman to discredit him. He believed his king, whom he had known since birth, was still a boy who could be manipulated. He was wrong. Viktor Dragunov, Nikolai began, his voice cold and devoid of all emotion. You are accused of high treason against the Northern Kingdom. A wave of gasps and murmurs swept through the hall. Viktor laughed, a short barking sound. Treason? On what grounds? On the word of this southern witch you have taken to your bed? She has poisoned your mind, my king. My mind is clearer than it has ever been, Nikolai said, his voice dangerously calm. And the evidence against you does not come from words, but from your own hand. Anastasia rose. She held a collection of scrolls and ledgers in her hands. In a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the hall, she laid out the case against him. She presented the falsified shipping manifests, each one bearing Viktor's signature. She showed the corresponding trade records from the neutral guilds, proving the sale of northern goods to rebel sympathizers. She unrolled a map and detailed the pattern of border skirmishes, showing how they perfectly coincided with Viktor's lost shipments, creating the very instability he claimed to be fighting against. She spoke for nearly an hour, her logic irrefutable, her evidence a crushing weight. With every word, Viktor's arrogant smirk faltered. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sickly gray pallor. He looked around at the faces of the other lords, seeking an ally, but found only shock and dawning horror. When Anastasia finished, she placed the ledgers on the table before the throne. The evidence is clear, she said, her gaze locking with Viktor's. For 5 years, you have systematically weakened this kingdom from within, funding its enemies with its own resources. You pushed for a war that you knew we would lose, a war that would have been the final stroke in your plan to seize power. Lies! Viktor roared, his composure finally shattering. He lunged forward, but the guards restrained him. She is the traitor. She has bewitched him. I did it for the North, to keep it strong, to keep it pure from outside influence. You did it for yourself, Nikolai said, rising from his throne. He descended the steps of the dais and stood before the man who had been his mentor. You betrayed my father's trust. You betrayed my trust. You would have sent thousands of my people to their deaths to satisfy your own greed and ambition. Nikolai looked out at the assembled lords. The law is clear. The punishment for high treason is death. Viktor sagged in the guard's grip, a broken man. The fight was gone, replaced by a pathetic, trembling fear. He had gambled for a throne and lost everything. Take him to the dungeons, Nikolai commanded. He will be executed at dawn. As the guards dragged the whimpering Viktor from the hall, a profound silence fell. The lords of the North looked at Anastasia, no longer with suspicion, but with a deep and growing respect. At first light, the sentence was carried out. No cheers, only the heavy, necessary silence of a kingdom setting a bone. A week later, the great hall was filled once more. But this time it was not for a trial, but for a celebration. It was a victory feast to honor the brave wolves who had defended the North. The hall was alive with music, laughter, and relief. The dark cloud of Viktor's conspiracy had been lifted, and the kingdom felt reborn. At the height of the celebration, Nikolai rose from his throne and held up a hand for silence. The hall quieted, all eyes turning to their king. He stood tall, a commanding figure, but his expression was not one of triumph, but of a deep, solemn humility. My people, he began, his voice resonating with power and emotion. We celebrate a great victory tonight. We celebrate the courage of our warriors and the strength of our kingdom. But we are not celebrating because of me. This kingdom survived because of one person. It survived because she believed when all others doubted. It survived because she saw the truth when the rest of us were blind. He turned his gaze to Anastasia, who sat beside him, her expression unreadable. It survived because she taught me that power without love is empty, that a king who does not listen is no king at all. He descended the steps of the dais, his movements deliberate. The entire court watched, holding its breath. He walked to where Anastasia sat, and, to the utter shock of everyone present, he knelt before her. The Alpha of the North, the most powerful man in the kingdom, knelt on the stone floor. He took her hand, his ice-blue eyes looking up at her, filled with a love and reverence that was plain for all to see. He was not a king addressing his subject. He was a man bearing his soul to the woman who owned it. "Anastasia Voren," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that made it tremble slightly. "I asked for your hand in a political arrangement. I offered you a crown and a title. I was a fool. I did not know what I was asking. Now I do." He brought her hand to his lips. "I don't want a queen at my side. I want the woman who made me fight to be someone better. I want the mind that sees what I cannot. I want the heart that taught mine how to beat again. I don't want you to be my queen. I want you to be my wife, my partner, my everything. I am not offering you a kingdom anymore, Anastasia. I am offering you my heart, my soul, my entire being, if you will have it." For a long moment, Anastasia was silent, her hazel eyes searching his. The hall was so quiet that the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. She looked at this powerful man kneeling before her, this arrogant king who had learned humility, this predator who had learned to love. He had not just won her respect. He had, against all odds, earned her heart. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. She stood and gently pulled him to his feet. "You already have it," she whispered, her voice for him alone. Then, louder, for the entire court to hear, she said, "I accept." The hall erupted. A thunderous roar of approval, of cheers, of stamping feet, shook the very foundations of the castle. The wolves of the north roared for their king, and for the warrior queen who had won his heart and saved their kingdom. Later that night, long after the last of the cheers had faded, they stood on the same balcony where they had their first real confrontation. The moon, once a sharp sliver, was now full and bright, bathing the snow-covered world in a soft, ethereal light. A lone wolf howled in the distance, a long, mournful cry that was answered by another, and then another, until the night was filled with the song of the pack. Anastasia leaned against Nikolai, his arms wrapped securely around her head resting on his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was a sound that had become her anchor. "It's a song of celebration," he murmured, his lips against her hair. "For us." "It's beautiful," she whispered, her gaze on the moonlit mountains. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, the cold air a pleasant sting on their skin. The future was not without its challenges. Rebuilding the trust Victor had broken would take time. Forging a true union between the North and Eldara would take work. But for the first time, the path ahead seemed not daunting, but full of promise. "Anastasia," he said softly. She tilted her head back to look at him. "Yes?" He didn't say anything. He simply looked at her, his eyes, once so cold, now filled with a warmth that was more potent than any fire. He lowered his head and kissed her. A slow, deep kiss that spoke of promises made and a future shared. It was a kiss that held the quiet strength of the mountains, the fierce passion of the wolf, and the profound peace of finally finding home. When he finally lifted his head, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. It was the smile he had seen her give the young general, the one that had sparked his jealousy. But now, it was for him. Only for him. It wasn't just love that had brought them here. It wasn't a political arrangement or a decree from a council. It was something deeper, forged through fire and choice. Two hearts that had learned to beat in the same rhythm. Not fate, choice. Not legend, love. Them.